Good evening. Welcome to this international launch of 4 titles published this month by Bloodaxe. And we've got poets and a translator from all parts of the world. You've got Nia Broomhall, who is launching her pamphlet, Backalong, which is here, is here. This is she was the winner of last year's Mslexia Women's Pamphlet Poetry Competition. And then we've got Neil Campbell, who's in Scotland, launching his 3rd collection, The Island in the Sound. Then we're going to have Sarah Holland-Batt, who's in Australia, in Brisbane. And in fact, it's I think 4 in the morning now at the moment. So many thanks to her for staying up all night to take part in this event. And then we have Laura Wittner, who's in Buenos Aires, and she is going to be accompanied by her translator, Juana Adcock, who's in Glasgow. So we've got poets all over the place. And what else? Yes, I should also mention that Sarah Holland-Batt is going to be touring Britain and during October and into November, doing a lot of events reading from her book, The Jaguar. And also Laura is going to be also here doing various events. Her book is published in partnership with the Poetry Translation Centre. Many thanks to them for all their work in putting the book together and in putting her tour together. And many thanks to the Australia Council for sponsoring Sarah Holland-Batt's visit. So we're going to start off with Nia Broomhall, who's going to read from her pamphlet, Backalong. Nia.
Thank you so much, Neil. I'm so excited to be here with all these amazing poets, and I want to say thank you to Bloodaxe and Mslexia for this opportunity to publish Backalong. I wrote most of this on my MA, which I did with Lancaster quite recently, and I went into the MA wanting to write poems that kind of sourced joy. That was what I wanted to do. And then during that process, my sister-in-law Nina died of cancer in March last year, and I loved her very much. And so the MA became this kind of weird process then of trying to continue this project that tried to source joy and then writing about grief. And eventually what I ultimately learned was that those two things aren't mutually exclusive, and actually we need to look at them both together in the face, really. And maybe that's what love is, and I really hope that that's what comes across most strongly from this book out of everything. So I'm going to read 3 poems about that process with Nina. I'm going to start off with Nina, Who Is Still Here, which is the first poem in the pamphlet and the only one that Nina got to read. Nina, Who Is Still Here. She needs the greenth of it, green as the grassy ease of it, the growth of trees. She's greedy for these green leaves, these weeds. She needs the fields, the beetle breeze, to see that she is real, that she is here, to see the gleam between the trees. She needs the grief of it, the green repeat of it, to greet the leaves where she has been. She needs the deep, clean green of it, the please, the grass, the ease of it. And really these, as you go through the pamphlet, it kind of loosely tracks the grieving process, which in places like makes no sense at all, really. And I'm going to read After She Died, which is really about the things that we do to try to navigate that awful phrase, the new normal of existing in a world that continues on, with someone really important missing out of it. After she died, I started wearing gold hoops in my ears like the women in my village did, women with big arms and hard hands. I found the small space above people's faces and the quiet to the right of the moon and kept my eyes there. I stacked books up to the surface, hooked a highlighter between my fingers, the colour that coral used to be. I bought a rug with an orange flower and walked carefully around its soft edge and curled my toes into its white centre. I pressed my back into the old stones of castles and the old stones of follies that looked like castles and stones. I roasted chickens and ate the skin, hot fat between my teeth, garlic like a salve, like a spell. I drive fast to folk songs, one hand tight on the wheel, my left arm outstretched like a huge single wing. And the follies in that poem lead me on to the next one. I think I'll just read folly. I'm really fortunate this year to be poet in residence at Painshill Park in Cobham in Surrey. If you don't know it, it's an 18th century landscape garden that was rediscovered in the 80s, and it's full of these kind of crazy towers and grottos and temples and ruins and things. And it was a place that I intended to go to with Nina many times, and we never got round to it, and now we won't. This is called Folly. We talked about coming here together. We never did. There's no picture of her in the window frame of the ruined abbey or on the bridge. She didn't pick up a pine cone. I don't know if it would have been windy that day, cold, low sun, if there would have been cygnets. There might have been, and the wind might have raised rough lines of waves that slipped towards us. This is a follied place. It built itself on stories made from brick and plaster and didn't care if they were true. Air-shaped a temple and a tower because it wanted them. Carve out the cave, glitter it, cast the statues, fix a tent in fiberglass, flood the tileworks and call it a lake. The fish won't know. They'll be caught again and put back. I remember when we came here, there were 12 cygnets. She stood in the window and her hair flew around her face. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nia. And I should have said that Backalong is also Nia's first pamphlet. So thank you very much for that. And also I need to thank Imtiaz Darker, who was the judge of the Mslexia Women's Pamphlet Competition this year and last year. And so many, many thanks to Imtiaz for picking Nia. Now we're going to hear from Niall Campbell in Fife in Scotland. Neil.
Good evening, everybody. So I'm going to be reading from this third collection. This first poem, I was thinking particularly of all the jobs I've had to do as a poet to make the writing possible, I suppose. You know, and all the different things you end up doing, be it bar work or chefing or unusual island jobs. And in the way that maybe first love has a deep impact on us and all future loves, I think the first job that you do probably has the same. And the first job that I had on the islands was sorting crabs, which is as glamorous as it sounds, in that you tipped live crabs from creels into a grading box, a sorting box, and you had to sift them out, big and small, big and small. Do that for hours and hours on end was the work. So it led to this thought about how it might impact the writing. So this is called Apprenticeship. Dusk on the water. The job was to watch, unracked, the wet, still dripping creels being tipped into the grading tray, alive with life. Our seas provided black-eyed velvet crabs, with small horns ridging their top plates. The work, to grade by size, those big as a fist, they pointed, big as a heart I saw, were lifted out as worth a better price. Ours you would weigh by hand and eye and a slow part of the mind. Young jeweler at a tray of breathing stones, arbiter at the filling, refilling box. The night progressing until the shed light drew out thick moths. To work was to find yourself drawn in, or was it drawn back to something careful and mysterious, hard-shelled and resistant, big as a fist or heart, The same rain falls on that shed and on this house. I did it 5 years, and then I did it the rest of my life. In terms of the book, Nocturally, my second collection, dealt a lot with being a parent of a very young child as a stay-at-home dad. And there was a line there saying that age was in my cup now, because I just felt particularly, although I'm quite youthful looking, I suppose, like I'm getting on a bit, and I think I am wearing down from the inside as I touch 40. But now I suppose I'm feeling the age side of things, just because people I care about are hitting a different age themselves. And so there's a poem here about my father helping renovate this house we've just moved into a few years ago. It goes off a bit of Scottish history where wood was so rare back hundreds of years ago that if you were a tenant and evicted from your property, you were allowed to take both the roof beams and the door with you. And so I read this it was a T.C. Smout book, and immediately the image there of a person carrying a door, going somewhere, but just carrying this door on their back, it's kind of struck me. And so I thought of my father and the work he was helping us do here. So a man carrying his own door. Ah, yes, the man is at his life again, or so I think, when watching him prince with his duties, easing nails from a hinge, the hinge from a grooved wall. He liked this work. The hammer stroke, the chisel peeling butter curls of whitest wood, their pattern fall around the job's circumference. And now it's lifted free, hauled free into the air, just like those tenants who, once evicted, since wood was rare, were free to take their doors with them. Can't you see it? The huge shield weight of a door being carried by a man, near 70 now, but just you try to share the weight or take an end. Oblivion, or something softer and just as dark, has said its name. The rain is knocking hard as light where he holds the wood beside his ear. And I will just read one more poem for this first section, if you will let me. I suppose in all poems about renovation, there is a kind of debt paid to the Seamus Heaney poem about the skylight and its hutch and hatch. And this is no different. Always we lived in old houses, because mainly we lived in Glasgow or Edinburgh or Leeds, kind of old industrial places where there was old houses, the windows haven't changed for 50 years, 100 years, whatever it might be. And it was the same when we moved into this house in deepest, darkest Fife. The only thing is we eventually got the windows changed. And it was just that shift, that unbelievable. I sat on the couch and kept having to stand up to check that the windows were still there because the clarity was unbelievable. So this is the windows. When those new windows, sashed and cased, were hoisted in, later than most I understood the phrase as clear as glass. Out went those wrinkled ancient fingerprints of pains, fogged, misted, smudged by time, or else holding a little breath of a ripple through their ice. All these years I didn't know I wasn't seeing clearly. But now, if asked to make my stand, I'd say that love comes with seeing things just as they are. Clear, detailed laburnum in September's yard, crisply swaying. First among the miracles was the laying hands on the blind. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Neil. Now we're going to hear from Sarah Holland-Batt, Her book that we're publishing is her first book published in the UK. It's called The Jaguar, which is the title of her third collection. And this is a retrospective, including most of the Jaguar, as well as selections from her first two collections, Aria and The Hazards. And I've been following Sarah's work for many, many years. And it was, so I was really delighted to be able to take her work up finally and publish her here. So, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Neil, and it's so wonderful to be reading with these incredible poets. I'll just start with the opening poem of my book, The Jaguar, and then I'll say a little something about it. My father as a giant koi. My father is at the bottom of a pond, perfecting the art of the circle. He is guiding the mottled zeppelin of his body in a single unceasing turn, like a monorail running on greased steel, like an ice skater swerving on a blade. His scales are lava and ember, dappled with carbon. His tail a luxurious Japanese fan. He is so far beneath the green skin of duckweed, he cannot make me out, or I him. What he knows is shrinking into round facts, days like mossed stones, each the same weight. Spears of water hyacinth rising around him like jail bars, reek of peat. He has been down there for years, ancient god of the dark, keeper of the single koan, moving in currents only he can sense, fluent as a windsock. He surfaces 3 times a day when the nurse brings a tray, cold blanched carrot and beef, white sauce fillet of whiting, pound cake. He cannot trust the scratched headlamps of his eyes, so he navigates by feel, angling his huge whiskered head mouth first towards the fork, weaving like an adder, charmed by smoke. Then he bites down to find the world suddenly there again, solid as metal and bait. So the book, The Jaguar, is a book about my father, in part about my father's long illness with Parkinson's disease. So there's a number of elegies in the book looking at my father's sort of last years and days. And here's another, The Gift. In the garden, my father sits in his wheelchair, garlanded by summer hibiscus, like a saint in a 17th century cartouche. A flowering wreath buzzes around his head, passionate red. He holds the gift of death in his lap, small, oblong, wrapped in black. He has been waiting 17 years to open it and is impatient. When I ask how he is, my father cries. His crying comes as a visitation, the body squeezing tears from his ducts tenderly, as a nurse measuring drops of calamine from an amber bottle, as a teen at the car wash wringing a chamois of suds. It is a kind of miracle to see my father weeping this freely, weeping for what is owed him. How are you? I ask again, because his answer depends on an instant's microclimate. His moods bloom and retreat like an anemone as the cold currents whirl around him, crying 1 minute, sedate the next. But today, my father is disconsolate. I'm having a bad day, he says, and tries again. I'm having a bad year. I'm having a bad decade. I hate myself for noticing his poetry, the triplet that should not be beautiful to my ear, but is. Day, year, decade, scale of awful economy. I want to give him his present, but it is not mine to give. We sit as if mother and son on Christmas Eve, waiting for midnight to tick over. anticipating the moment we can open his present together. First, my father holding it up to his ear and shaking it. Then me helping him peel back the paper. The weight of his death knocking. And once the box is unwrapped, it will be mine. I will carry the gift of his death endlessly. Every day I will know it, opening in me. And I'll just read one more. This is an earlier poem. This is a poem from my second book, The Hazards. And part of that book was writing about the landscape that I grew up in Queensland, which is subtropical, muggy, hot. I was born in a town called Surfers Paradise. I'm, as far as I know, the only poet from Surfers Paradise. And essentially it's a sort of tropic, broiling Queensland poem. This is The Orchid House. Pegged under banana trees, our backyard hothouse was fixed summer that boiled all year. A green humpy breathing gauze in meshy sheets. Indoors it poured artificial rain. Under that slatted sunlight, I crept the spider-heavy shelves where exotics festered in their Latin names. I talked the twist wires tight around each trumpeting neck, chivied long legs from potted dark, as outside the clouds blew back like years. My grandfather spoke a strange pidgin there, knew cat's face from Queen of Sheba, snake flower, soldier's crest, sulphur tail. A decade late, I found a wrinkled block of newsprint under the orange crucifix. 6 men waist deep in the Mekong, where the war's end would never come. Death never reached those suburbs, not really. Bodies in their Sunday best never lay on our kitchen table, stiff as celluloid dolls. And last goodbyes were told by nurses in chemical code. When Grandad died, the wonky shack grew wild and creepers curtained over. Through walls thin and threadbare, I heard them hissing, the cold, wet tendrils that could strangle and grew on air. Tea tree, tangleroot, tongue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Now we're going from Brisbane, Australia to Buenos Aires to hear Laura Wittner reading in Spanish. And Juana Adcock, her translator, is in Glasgow. They're reading from the book called Translation of the Root, which is actually a translation of a single collection published in Argentina, Traducción de la Ruta. And the book is dual language, Spanish, English. So if you get the book, you can appreciate the work in both languages at the same time. And tonight, Juana's going to read some of the poems first in English, and then Laura is going to read in Spanish. So you'll be able to know what the poem is about and then hear it in the original Spanish. So start off with Juana.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
So we're going to read a series of poems from the first section of the book, which is called 10 Real Answers to Fictional Questions. And the first poem we're going to read is Why We Women Get Oven Burns. It's a little red mark. We've all got it. Mine is on my left hand, the one I write with. If I stare at my oven burn long enough, it unfolds into 3 above the radius. My wrist goes 3 ways, other dimensional. And if you squint, you can see my mother's wrist, my grandmother's wrist, and in a lurch forward, the wrist of my daughter, mosquito bitten, burnished and set for the mark of the red hot grill.
¿Por qué las mujeres nos quemamos con el horno? La marquita roja la tenemos todas. Acá en la mano izquierda con la que escribo está también mi quemadura de horno. Si la miro muy fijo sobre el radio, se me despliega en tres. Se me tridimensiona la muñeca y entrecerrando los ojos pueden verse la muñeca de mi madre, la de mi abuela y en un tirón hacia adelante la de mi hija, picada de mosquitos, pulida y ya dispuesta a la marca de la rejilla ardiente.
Why, on bad days, we look at holiday photos. Not to reminisce on ourselves walking down that street where the green traffic lights were scattered in the fog, in a very ancient stratum of sky. The moon also did its little number, but rather to say, once we slept in front of this window, next to this patio we drank coffee in complete silence, a solitude complete, chewing on this foreign black bread and writing in green ink. I am I am I am I.
¿Por qué los días malos miramos fotos de viajes? No para recordarnos caminando por esta calle donde las luces verdes de los semáforos se esparcían en la niebla y en un estrato muy antiguo del cielo también la luna hacía su numerito, sino para decirnos, una vez dormimos frente a esta ventana, junto a este patio tomamos café, en un silencio completo y una completa soledad, masticando este pan negro y extranjero y anotando en tinta verde. Yo soy yo, yo soy yo, yo soy yo.
Why it shouldn't rain on Sunday nights. Thunder roars, and my children are at their other house. First a crack of thunder far away, then another nearby. Finally, an earth-shattering groan, tearing through every empty room, and the only lit room where I'm at work, late at night. There's thunder, and I don't have anyone to comfort, which for a second feels like not having anyone to comfort me. But no, a mother recomposes herself quickly, even if her children are at their other house.
¿Por qué no tiene que llover los domingos a la noche? Truena y mis hijos están en su otra casa. Primero un trueno lejos, después uno más cerca, un trueno finalmente atronador que retumba en cada cuarto vacío y en este único cuarto iluminado donde trabajo a medianoche. Truena y no tengo a quien calmar lo que por un segundo se parece a no tener quien me calme. Pero no, una madre se recompone pronto, aunque los hijos estén en su otra casa.
Why we talk when we talk about love. Today you said dinner instead of lunch. Then I said lunch instead of dinner, speaking of another dinner, another lunch. We both said the wrong words, but I trust there will be a solution where we can get back on the path of accuracy and accord.
¿Por qué hablamos cuando hablamos de amor? Hoy vos dijiste cenar por almorzar. Después yo dije almorzar por cenar, hablando de otra cena, otro almuerzo. Los dos dijimos palabras erróneas, pero confío en que habrá una solución, en que podremos retomar la senda del bien hablar, del bienestar.
Why it's urgent to get out on the road. How we yelled as we did that almost U-turn. We had an Ital Park moment in the thick forest of our 40-somethings.
¿Por qué es urgente salir a la ruta? ¿Cómo gritamos en esa vuelta casi en U? Tuvimos un momento de Ital Park en el espeso bosque de los 40 y pico.
Why remedies over time betray us? That sky when I crossed the train tracks, brazen with clouds across 3 plains, over another 3 of darkness, the most intense one as opaque as my brain in the backlight. And that sky when I crossed the tracks, though on Sunday, with a bald brilliance, which was the sketched out sun perforating a glass wall with 1,000 stories tempered at the same time by shadows of trees and other buildings and of all the fledgling shadows of 6 or 7 p.m. should have been capable of cheering me a little.
¿Por qué los remedios con el tiempo nos traicionan? Ese cielo cuando crucé las vías, con su jactancia de nubes en 3 planos, sobre otros 3 de oscuridad, la más intensa, tan opaca como el trasluz de mi cerebro. Y ese cielo cuando crucé las vías, pero el domingo con un audaz fulgor, que era el sol dibujado, perforando una pared de cristales de 1000 pisos, moderada a la vez por sombras de árboles y de otros edificios y de todo, lo sombrío incipiente de las 6 o las 7, tendrían que haber sido capaces de mejorarme un poco.
Why it is advisable to read in bars. If the poem interests you, you stop at that page long enough for a small coffee stain to occur. A small, undeciphered coffee stain. One with reminiscences of scrubland, backstitch, frog's head. This confirmation of materiality taking matters into its own hands thickens the poem, ennobles the page 39 to be exact.
¿Por qué conviene ir a leer a bares? Si el poema te interesa, te detenés lo suficiente en esa página como para que se produzca una manchita de café. Una manchita de café no decodificada o con reminiscencias de yuyal de pespunte, de cabeza de rana. Esta confirmación de la materialidad por mano propia adensa el poema y ennoblece la página. La 39, para ser exactos.
Oh, we must reconstruct ourselves all the time. At 8 in the morning, sitting at the screen, I hear broken glass being swept up in a nearby space, orally connected to the bathroom, but perhaps further away due to one of those tricks of sound bouncing unexpectedly off buildings. Implausibly large pieces dragged and smashed together as though by a mechanical scoop, with a gigantic, or rather a fantasy, fork, a science fiction instrument created for the domestic cerebral task of sweeping up rubble and glass.
¿Por qué hay que reconstruirse a cada rato? A las 8 de la mañana, sentada ante el monitor, oigo que se barren vidrios en un espacio vecino, auditivamente conectado con el baño, pero tal vez más lejos por uno de esos trucos que sobrevienen entre edificaciones. Pedazos inverosímiles de grandes, arrastrados y entrechocados, como con pala mecánica, una pala gigantesca, o más bien de fantasía, un instrumento de la ciencia ficción creado para la doméstica tarea cerebral del barrido de cascotes y cristales.
When I like a song a lot, I need to print the lyrics. Ink somehow affirms me, and I don't think I'll get any tattoos now. Instead, I'll sing from a printed sheet, accompanied by the singing voice. The same way I put ice cubes into tea and watch them dissolve in their foam immediately after cracking and yielding. The same way I press down my feet on the line between the two tiles, or on this humid footprint that begins to dry upon departure.
¿Por qué cuando me gusta mucho una canción tengo que imprimir la letra? La tinta me afirma sobre algo y ya no creo que me haga tatuajes. Más bien voy a entonar leyendo de una hoja acompañada por la voz cantante. Así como pongo hielitos en el té y los miro disolverse en su espuma justo después de crujir y ceder. Así como apoyo los pies en el límite entre las dos baldosas o sobre esta huella húmeda que va secándose a medida que se aleja.
Why, if they knock me down 1,000 times, I get up. The courtyards, the bathrooms and kitchens with square sinks, the semicircular spaces with wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling windows, a basketball hoop on the street so that anyone can have a shot, the exact coffee that lays waste to it all and elevates it all for half an hour. The sky when it blanches, the pronunciation of a foreign language surrounding me like an atmosphere charged with occult meanings. Chatting with my daughter on the balcony, chatting with my daughter on a mattress flung across the living room, no sheets. The hand of my teenage son in my hand when nobody sees him, tracing the same caress as in childhood. The memory of all caresses, leaving behind their indelible lines.
So this is the last poem of the series, and I just wanted to say thank you so much to Bloodaxe Books and to the Poetry Translation Center, and of course to Juana for this wonderful version in Spanish and in English, and also for the work we got to do together for the translation process. So the last poem is ¿Por qué si me postran 1000 veces me levanto? Los patios internos, los baños y cocinas con pileta cuadrada, los ambientes semicirculares con ventanal corrido, un aro de básquet en la calle para que tire cualquiera, el café exacto que todo lo arrasa y todo lo eleva durante media hora, el cielo cuando se decolora hasta quedar en blanco, la pronunciación de un idioma extranjero rodeándome como una atmósfera cargada de sentidos ocultos. Las charlas con mi hija en el balcón, las charlas con mi hija en un colchón atravesado en el living, sin sábanas. La mano de mi hijo adolescente en mi mano cuando nadie lo ve, trazando la misma caricia que en la infancia. La memoria de todas las caricias que dejaron su dibujo indeleble. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. It was lovely to hear them in Spanish and also to hear those beautiful translations by Juana. And that was the section 10 Real Answers to Fictional Questions from the book. The book also has 2 more sections, quite different. So you'll have to get the whole book to get the full sense of their great work that they have. Before we go on to the other readings, I just want to say that Neil Campbell is doing a lot of readings from his book this autumn and into next spring. And as I mentioned, we have Sarah Holland-Batt's going to be doing readings across Britain, and so are Juana Adcock and Laura Wittner. And if you go to the Bloodaxe Books website, go to the homepage, all 3 books are actually shown there. You just need to click on them and you can find out about the book, and you can also click and find out where all the readings are. There are a lot of readings going on for each of those books. And of course, we hope you will want to order them, which you can do from the website or from your favorite bookshop. So we're now going to go back to the readings again, and we're going to have a second set from Nia Broomhall reading from Backalong, and maybe she'll tell us the nature of what Backalong means. Nia.
Thank you so much. I will do that. I have just realised I forgot to thank Imtiaz Darg, which is the worst omission, and I'm really sorry. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So one of the things I did in the months after Nina died was I started writing sonnets, which I hadn't done before, and particularly sonnets about sonnets about growing up in rural Somerset in the 1980s. And I found it really, really comforting to do that for a couple of reasons. I think one, because looking back at the past like that, it felt self-contained. It felt like a safe space to type into some things without worrying about the grieving process. And also the formal nature of the sonnet I found in a really geeky way, very appealing, all that counting. I found really soothing, a bit like doing a puzzle or something. And so I'm going to read 3 of these sonnets. The first one is called The Floods and the Frogs, and it's the first one I wrote. The Somerset Levels, which is where I'm from, are designed to be a floodplain, and we used to go out on these floods all the time. And one of the things we did was rescue the frog spawn, which the frogs had laid in the floods, thinking it was permanent water. The Floods and the Frogs. These fields were made for floods, the greener grass an inch below the surface there, each break in winter cloud a flash of mirrored glass. And Backalong, frogs found that endless lake and came and came and come again to spawn, to claim the shallow greenlit world unseen. But frogs and floods can't keep the grass for long. The fields dry up, the tadpoles drown in weeds. We dipped our hands and clutched at the soft slip, the quickened light. We fumbled jars to heft the dripping marbles to the stream. We tipped them in and wished them well. And then we left. Each year, the frogs flood back, and then they go. They make the same mistakes. They never know. I was going to do a different one second, and then I told my 18-year-old, and she said, no, do this one instead. So I'm going to do this one. It's called My Parents' Accent. I'm really conscious that when I read these poems, my wildly unstable West Country accent kind of comes back. There's nothing I can do about that, and this poem is about that. My Parents' Accent. They sound like sun-warmed curves of hamstone now to me. They sound like open fields and green and blue. They whisper wisps of hay right down the 303 behind an HGV. They sound like shapes of hills, like bread, like sweet inside a stalk, like rain on a brass band. They sound like wooden spoons, like little leaps in shiny shoes, like hands in pockets. And with them, my voice sounds like that too. It rolls in humming grass, unfurls and curls. It stays a day or maybe 2, but it can't hold. And when they go, for good, that voice will fade from me, like green, like light, like cows that cried in fields behind their house on August nights. And I'm going to finish on Backalong, which comes at the end of the book. And it's a very useful word, this dialect word, Backalong, meaning any point in the past that you like. You don't have to explain when that was at all, just at any point in the past. And I was thinking about this, and when I wrote this poem, and it comes last in the book because it was the only Somerset sonnet I wrote that led me back to Nina. It's called Backalong. We never need to know how long ago it was. It happened Backalong. It was then, it has been. There's comfort in the close and far of those soft vaguenesses, the years or hours ago, the spring, the war, the spring, those Christmases, or when he said he'd stay, or when they built the Tor, or crowned a king, or made the songs, the laws, the motorway. And Backalong keeps all these things behind a gently locked glass door. Their shapes are blurred inside. It doesn't matter when she died. Backalong. See? Backalong, ice covered the earth. Backalong, one hot afternoon, she walked fast through the grass to feel it move. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nia. And now we're going to hear from Neil Campbell again. Neil.
Hello again. Yes, just to echo all the thanks of for being part of this evening and these other wonderful poets. The next I'll read 3 poems again in this set, and the first of these poems deals with men's dislike often of other men, and I was thinking particularly of the threats we might offer to each other. You know, kind of growing up West Scotland, and you might threaten to give somebody a doing with its subtle eroticism, which isn't the poem or isn't the threat I'm going to deal with. The threat I'll deal with is I'll knock the living daylight out of you. Purely because I recalled this threat and found something quite subtle in it, the kind of placement of light inside of a body that you dislike. So this is called the transformed fight. The car park has its own epiphanies. Come closing time, a large crowd listening past the breaking sorrows of the night. I'll knock the living daylights out of you. A phrase we find replacing blood with light, as though there in the words before the start, the slyest act of tenderness. 2 men go swaying like new candles in a church, acknowledging the late May radiance that's even in this other man they hate. I never heard of kindness stretched to this, both a spring window that they try to reach. The second book I wrote was Nocturne, so again, dealing with my son and being at home with my son. Kind of grotesquely, he's now 10 years old, and the kind of epiphanies of fatherhood are a little bit rarer than in those first weeks and months and things like that. But recently I was teaching him to cycle, and it's such a curious act because part of the act of training is for you not to be needed and not to be holding and not to be there, preferably. So you can imagine me here, the poem dawning on me as it happens. Morning lessons. Cold Sunday in the school's tarred playground. The flat course round the shuttered classrooms and mute bells. I was out of breath, running and running, balancing what he couldn't balance yet. The speeding, moving bicycle, its blood-like frame. Keep going, I kept saying as his legs whirled their small aired nothings. Everything then seemed a short road towards new manhood, adulthood, weaving directionless, but here and there he started to guide straight. Time's rain fell on me when he steadied and pushed off as if from my hands. I was still running forwards, even when I shouted to be left behind. And last poem of the night to end on, just again, nothing but thanks for organizing the event and the patience with my poems. This is the last poem in the collection, and basically it just deals with late walks, a late walk particularly along a beach on South Uist, and particularly this idea of sounds. I mean, the book is all about this, sounds and music, and the two kind of combining. So the sound, and it begins with a small wee excerpt from Caliban the Tempest. Be not afeared, the isle is full of noises. Listen, footsteps under moonlight. You left the echoing road, the verge blanket of the grass, to now walk just on sand, each footstep saying hush, as if to the one previous. Hush, hush, the beach path all feldspar and dusted quartz. Hush, hush, the razor shell, the conicals of whelks. Alone, passing the snores of driftwood hunkered on the beach silk, you might hear the something else that isn't the sea returning to the beach, or the corncrake in the small blacked out cathedral of collected thatch, that isn't the lighthouse making the one sound of its light. Autumn coming in on the black Atlantic, you hear your pulse responding to the frost, singing like a second bird from the gardens of your neck and your wrist and breast. It's lub-dub as a pity tune, now a mating track, now the last call of the dodo or the great auk. All the disappearing sounds of the world come back, here beneath the percussion of the starlight and the rustle in the grasses. And the thought occurs, surprising you, of a bow hand weaving in the lateness the high strings of the wanderer's porch light, the low strings of the stoplight on its path. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neil. And now we're going back to Brisbane, to Sarah, hoping that she's still awake, because it's around 4 o'clock in the morning now, isn't it? Just past. Sarah.
Thank you, Neil. It's actually 5 a.m, so a little bit more civilized now. I will also just read 3 more poems, and I'm going to take you to Surfers Paradise, which I mentioned in my last reading first. If you haven't heard of it or don't know about Surfers Paradise, it's a beautiful beach that we've managed to ruin by sort of crumbing with skyscrapers and casinos, and it's my hometown. And so this poem here is a sort of attempt to look at that paradise as a kind of paradise, as a dark paradise. Approaching paradise. Here in the white, white wing of a gull, you may glimpse paradise in the flensing sun. The prodigal sea bent back on itself has the rough green mind of paradise. Paradise is in the breadfruit's low sling, the purple scroll of bougainvillea up a wall. It is in the yacht's clatter and wheel, the fisherman's nylon stringing the wind. You will find paradise in a whiting drowning in a bucket of fresh water, in the jammed blade of a fish scale like quicklime under the thumb. Women roast themselves in coconut oil, and children run bare-legged in paradise. Praise them. And praise the black-faced bat travelling even in sleep through paradise. This fringe of storm-streaked shacks with genuflecting surfers riding in, this line of Norfolk pine, wet dogs nosing the muck of a king tide. Praise the bloated body washed in, the gentle nibbling of baitfish and brim, bikini-clad tourists jerked out by rips, the summer and violence of paradise. A shark's slit corpse gapes pink on the jetty, its head yanked on a hook like a sacrifice. Its shank is smooth and black as paradise. Men with knives kneel down like seraphim. I was really taken by Nia's mentioning of Backalong. It's such a beautiful idea, and it got me thinking about the particular words that come with particular places. And so I've decided to read this poem, which is called Blue Quandong, which is one of my favourite Australian words. It's a native plum tree. It's a love poem. Blue Quandong. Nights here are long. Starlight frays the palms. Sky a black sarong shaken out to dry. I hear emerald doves in the calabash. I see the 1,000 flowers of the cannonball tree. I remember pepper leaf, the singe of torched ginger. Think of you on the equator from these cooling tropics. I miss you, a line I would never write. Grief is rebetiko heard through an open window as the quandong fruits at dusk. Wild basilica distilling its sugars into flying fox nectar, rounding its midnight planets of Marrakesh indigo, an orrery of blue moons. And to finish, I wasn't going to read this one, but after hearing Neil's beautiful crab poem, I thought I should read a crab poem of my own. This poem is called The Grip. The mud crabs shadow-boxed when my father prized them from wicker, lopsided nips that could sever a finger. In the trap, they jostled like stones. I topped the cooler brimful of ice and seawater, morgue cold. My father fed them into the slush with a sous chef's precision. I watched their sparring slow. Haymakers blurred to lurches, then quarter-inch twitches, then nothing. They went under. Drifting in the polar slurry, the crabs made a sinister clacking. Their sleep was deep, deep. Sometimes I'd reach in to stroke one, a blue-black granite chassis underlaid with a fidgetry of limbs. When it came time to butcher them, my father laid each on the jetty, tenderly stroked the thorax, then drove his crabbing knife clean through the brain. He said it was humane, but for a moment they'd come alive again, legs unspringing their hinges, pincers grappling at air. In the neurological ward, I remember this as I watched my father wake. I won't come back, he said pre-op, but he did. He hallucinates lunges at things I can't see. A sudden twist in the bedsheet, he sits beatific and takes the invisible delicately between two fingers, like a pinch of salt or sheet of Belgian linen. When I reach to receive it, his hand clamps on my wrist, and I'm stunned by the strength of his grip, like the claw severed from the body, still grasping closed, like the mind exposed under an oval of bone to a shock of raw breeze. For the first time, the last time, he wants to live. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And we're now going to come together for a discussion. Thank you all for reading those gorgeous poems. It was wonderful to hear them all. You've all got to turn on your video and your unmute yourselves so we can all be here, 6 of us. Just near to come. Yes, we're all here now. And meanwhile, we've had some good wishes from Jane Clark, who's been watching us from Assisi. So this international event is going around the world. One of the questions that's come through on the YouTube chat is from Joe Pitter, who says, Laura, could you talk about your poetry journey? And it occurs to me that tonight we've got Neil, who's just publishing his third collection. We've got Sarah, who has 3 collections in her retrospective. We've got a first pamphlet from Nia, and Laura's book is actually her 12th collection. So I wonder whether we could start off by Laura saying something about how she's got to her 12th collection. I think readers in this country will be familiar with Neil's work and will have followed his first 3 books. His first 2 books are now up to this 3rd one, and they'll have the same opportunity to do that with Sarah's book. But of course, with yours, you just get the 1 collection, your 12th. I was wondering if you could say something about how you reached that and what that book represents in terms of your work.
Actually, yeah, some of the books were very small things we made with friends when we were young. So it's not, perhaps in that 11, the number 11 includes some anthologies and things like that. This is the book in Spanish. It was published here in Argentina in 2020. And last year it was also published in Brazilian Portuguese, which I'm very happy about. And well, I don't know. It's very difficult for me to talk about what I write and why and how. So it's just like, for me, it's like what I like to do more. And I don't write every day or every week or even every month. It's poems come to me when they come. So I write very slowly, and those perhaps 11 books are very short books like this one. So I don't know, it's like, I guess when I write poetry, I mainly write sounds, or I write about sound, or perhaps music, and rhythm is the most important thing for me, or which presents to me mainly how that collection of sounds can say something or sing something, and then that's always the beginning. And that's, I'm also a translator, and that's why I'm very especially grateful to Juana, because I know how how the time it takes and how difficult it is to translate poetry, which is also my favorite thing to translate. So I guess it's just a recollection of sounds from others, sounds from the world, and from other languages, and I don't know, that's how. I don't think it's making sense. Anyway, it's not easy for me to talk about what I write, and it's even more difficult to talk about it in English and through Zoom. So I'm trying to put some ideas together.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Because I actually know your work because I published some of it in Poetry London. The manuscript came to me last summer or whenever it was, or 5 or 6 months ago, and it just immediately stood out. It was just incredible. I loved the translations. I
thank
just felt they
you.
were so fresh. I just found that really the effort and that must have gone into it, I just thought was incredible. But I wondered, were you paired together, yourself and Juana? Or did you discover each other, or what was the kind of story behind that?
So Juana, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so I was contacted by the Poetry Translation Center, and I was asked to do some samples of Laura's work. They were very interested in publishing her. They'd been looking for an author from South America, and they were really struck by Laura's work, and so they wanted to find the right translator. And yeah, so I was really lucky, because normally the way it goes, certainly for other books that I've translated, it's a lot more of the translator having to kind of knock on doors and be like, okay, this is an author that I really want to translate, and please have a look at it, and so on. And it's a process that can take forever. But in this case, it was the other way around, and I was just so grateful for that. And the whole process, working with Laura, there were so many interesting conversations, and the way that was facilitated as well by the Poetry Translation Center, who are just like such a joy to work with. Yeah, it was really, really lovely. I really enjoyed it.
Can I ask you about your own writing, Juana? Because you're from Mexico. But you write in Spanish and English, don't you?
Yes, that's right. I was born and grew up in Mexico, and I was brought up bilingual, actually. And yeah, I started out writing in Spanish, and then I moved to Scotland. And after a few years of trying to find my voice again in English, I started publishing in English. And now I'm kind of swapping, switching and swapping a bit between the two. And yeah, it's a bit of a mad process. And translation always feeds into it, whether I'm translating my own work, but especially translating other people's work, and being able to kind of really delve into somebody else's brain and the way that they've assembled a certain scene or a poem, and the different voices that they use, and you know, scratching my head all day about like why they would have put that comma there and not over there, and you know, being able to ask the author all these questions is always really useful. And in the case of Laura, it's great because she's a translator also, so she knows why I need to know why that comma was placed particularly there. And you know, because some authors might be a bit like, well, you know, you're the translator, you deal with it, I don't care. But yeah, with Laura it was a lot more involved and a lot more collaborative, and that was really fun.
It was very funny for me to be on the other side. I'm always the one who's asking. It was wonderful.
Coming back to Neil, your first book was very much grounded in the Outer Hebrides where you grew up. Then you moved to England, and then latterly you moved back to Scotland. But in a sense, you've come full circle on the third book, where you're going back to the South Uist, aren't you? But with a kind of broader perspective. You're not just writing about your island, but many islands. I was wondering whether you could say something about that tangent in your work.
Yeah, I think it was Moontide was very much about growing up on the Outer Hebrides, and then Knockshuri, it felt like the world kind of was shut away and was just inside the room of being a parent. And so these poems again were kind of reaching out again, and it was kind of the road out led to the islands and then through and past the islands as well. So there's a lot of poems about the islands, but then kind of, as you say, jump off points, just reflecting, I suppose, the stage in life I'm at as well. You know, wanting to test things poetically with a few longer poems, which I protected the good audience from tonight. So there's a little bit of that, and yeah, just interest in kind of life situations I'm kind of going through. So I suppose Moontide was a bit more about growing up on the islands, and this is kind of continuing to grow and just see where I am now in life.
And Sarah, you have the experience of actually revisiting your first two collections in putting together the Jaguar, the selected poems. How did that feel to you in terms of looking at your own progress through your work?
I think it sort of clarifies the poems that you don't love anymore. I mean, it's sort of slightly excruciating looking back at early poems, but through that you can kind of see, I can see what I was reading across the books. I can see where I was living. You know, they were written, a couple of them on different continents. And I found it sort of quite clarifying to be able to snip out things. It's sort of an opportunity to slightly self-edit. I sort of feel it's sacrilegious to actually edit the poems. You know, I know there's two schools of thinking about that, and there's an Australian poet I adore, Robert Gray, who constantly goes back and tinkers with his poems, and so there's sort of like 10 versions of a poem depending on which collected poems you have it in. I sort of didn't do any of that, but it was sort of interesting. I could see the development of my thinking as a poet, and I think my early book, like many early books, was sort of quite terse and quite short, and the books have gotten longer, but the gaps between books have been quite long too. So I was relating to what Laura had said, in that I'm also not hugely prolific. I don't write every day or anything like that. The poems really need to arrive for me to want to write them. And then I think the second book, I was sort of interested in place and travel. And the third book kind of wasn't subject matter that I would have chosen, the poems about my father, but it kind of felt inescapable to kind of grapple with. So it's an interesting process, certainly, going back and sort of snipping some out and thinking about the shape of how you've kind of evolved as a poet. I certainly feel, paradoxically, I think that my most recent book is my most relaxed, which is, I don't know whether that's always the trajectory, but perhaps it is. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And now Nia, coming as someone just starting out, as it were, but you've been writing for some time, haven't you?
Well, yes, I think I was always that kid who was going to be a writer and just didn't question it, and then couldn't quite figure out why it hadn't happened, but I didn't know what to do. I don't think sort of came out of that. rural working class background and just didn't know where to go. And it makes it sound really bad, but then I became a teacher. So then I became a teacher. I actually really love teaching. I've been teaching for about 23 years. And I do think actually coming to it later, so I started my MA sort of when I turned 40, and I think actually it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I feel like I'm making up for lost time. Like I feel like the need to just there's a Gillian Clarke poem, isn't there, that says "Write like the wind." It's that "write like the wind." I feel like I want to do that because I feel like I wasted time, but at the same time I wouldn't have been the same poet back then. And I have more that I want to say now, I think. Official.
Now, one thing we do in these events is we also ask the poets taking part if they are things they'd like to ask each other or say about each other's books. And I was wondering whether any of you would like to kick off in relation to, because you've all read each other's books. Anyone like to start?
I'll hop in, Neil. I was really fascinated, Nia and Neil, that you both had sonnet sequences sort of running through your work, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sonnet form and how those kinds of sequences come about. You know, Neil, I know you've got a sequence running through your work about islands, and Nia, you've got a sort of Somerset sequence, I think it is, if I'm remembering correctly. Do you sort of have the idea of the sequence in mind when you start, or is it something that just sort of you find yourself returning to certain forms or subjects? How does that work for you both?
You go first, Nia.
I loved it when I noticed that you had a sonnet sequence. I was like, yeah, when I read yours. I think, like I said earlier, I was drawn to them because of the form, and I needed a bit of an escape. I needed boundaries. I needed to be able to write in this kind of, I know it was going to be 14 lines. I knew there was going to be a shift. I knew there was going to be this and that. And I felt like childhood memories lend themselves really well to that kind of sonnet where you've got that shift where you can kind of then look back on what you're looking at. And so, but now I've done so many of them, and I have more than that are in the pamphlet. It's almost like now whenever I start writing about Somerset, it just falls into a sonnet because now I cannot split them up in my head. But I quite like that. I feel like sometimes I'm in the mood to write a sonnet, and sometimes I'm in the mood to not write a sonnet. But the sonnets, I think, take me, I was trying to figure it out. I think it's at least 6 times longer than anything else. So it's which is terrible. And I kind of wish I could write them more speedily, but I can't. I don't know if they take you longer, Neil, but mine take me forever.
Yeah, I mean, mine, I suppose it might link into the fact there's some longer poems in the book as well, in that you have an idea for a poem and then you want to go somewhere else and continue the thought or kind of complicate the thought. I mean, certainly the sonnets for the islands as they began, I think there was Fuchai and Lingai and Eriskay as kind of the islands beside my house, you know, or my childhood house. A couple of them were uninhabited islands, and just imagining a history or a poem for them, it was kind of an act of, I saw as tenderness. But then you want to complicate it, and so I was reading about the island of Delos just randomly, not looking for anything particularly, but I was doing some reading about Greece, and I found on Delos, so affiliated with Apollo, you weren't allowed to die or be born on this island. So if you were about to die, you were taken off. And if you were a pregnant woman, you were taken off as well, and could only return when the child was born. And how could you not write a poem about that island? And then it kind of went on and on. So I don't know how many there even are, but there must be 5 or 6 island poems. But it was just about the complication and then the complication. And I do think it leads into the longer poems as well.
Yeah, we had a discussion there, didn't we, about your sonnets, about whether to put them as a group or to scatter them through the book. And I think they work better scattered through, because then they're a kind of counterpoint to the poems about your sister-in-law. There's a kind of balance between the two. Whereas very often the temptation is just to put them in one block, isn't it?
Yeah, and I was worried about that, and it took a really long time to get the right order, and I agonized over it. Tell me, people who write full-length collections, how on earth do you order a full-length collection? Because the pamphlet killed me trying to get it in the right order. It must be so hard.
Yeah. Well, let me jump in and ask Sarah one back then, put her on the spot. Because you mentioned in your own reading there that you don't write every day. And, I admired the gaps between your collections. Genuinely, the word is admired. There's a lot of poets I love take time between their books, And I just wondered, is it something you find difficult or something you find enjoyable? Like, how's your feeling to not writing or silence? Like, what's happening?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it also just comes back to my lifelong love of Elizabeth Bishop and my admiration of her self-editing in a way. So I write more poems than I publish, and I like to think that I've been judicious about the ones that I put in the book. So I sort of feel it belongs to that same principle that applies to just editing the poem and saying what you can say in as few words as possible. I sort of feel that on a larger scale with my books. If anything, I regret slightly, putting certain poems in. I sort of have an agonized relationship between the poems that I want in books and those that I sort of feel are lesser poems. So I don't know. It's probably also like the pragmatic answer is I have a really busy work life, so I just don't find the time to write all the time. And the second part is I do need a sort of quiet mind and a sense of stillness to write, and I don't always sadly achieve that with all the other things that I'm doing. So it's sort of partially just pragmatic. And irritatingly, whenever I finally do get on holiday, the first thing I want to do is write poems, which is kind of the last thing you're supposed to actually do when you're taking a break. But I do find it's sort of partially circumstantial, partially probably just constitutional. I don't always love it when there's lots and lots of books from a poet and you sort of feel as though you wish they'd published half of the book and another half of that book and not put all the material out in the world. So it's sort of a little bit of my personality and a little bit of a sense of self-discipline and not putting everything out there. Does that kind of make sense? And also just pragmatically, I do not have the time to write all the time, but nor do I think I'd have lots to say if I sat down to write a poem every day. I sort of feel you need to wait for the poem for what is the question of what is the poem in this experience. Otherwise it just becomes sort of constant documentation, if that makes sense.
100%.
Yeah, I think something else that occurred to me during the reading is that you're all very conscious of sound and the way in which you were using sound in the poems. Some of the poems were quite gorgeous in the way that sound was being used. When you're actually writing, do you read the poem aloud as you're writing it, or afterwards, so trying out the sound, or does it come purely on the page? Anyone want to jump in?
I'll answer that first. I read my poems out loud over and over and over and over and over again, and I think that's how I sort of smooth out the things that feel extraneous, or sort of the things that don't quite land. So yeah, for me, the musicality of the poem is a really central thing, and I don't think you can really edit for that unless you're reading it out loud. Although you do sound a little bit mad if your neighbours can hear you, but.
I just had a little thought about it. If anyone follows me on social media, they'll know that I've done one poem at least, where rather than just showing the poem as a photo, I've tried to record myself reciting it. And I kind of felt that was almost returning the poem to the poem. I think there is this weird kind of idea of the page poem or the stage poem. My poems are written for the page, but they're not page poems. And I felt it was to actually recite it was an important act of actually introducing what the poem is to me and hopefully will be to other people, because it is the sounds of, as it's recited, especially somebody like listening to Nia's work as well. I just loved it. The music of it, I just thought was phenomenal. So dexterous. It was incredible. So, yeah. What about yourself, Nia?
I do read them out loud, but I really hate writing first drafts. I find it really excruciating. So I try and do it really quickly and then spend ages editing, and I love editing. And then the sounds normally come in one of the later drafts, so almost like almost like I'll do the first draft really quickly, and then I'll go back and see which sounds have kind of naturally come out, and then I'll beef those up, if that makes sense. Like because I don't think I would be very good at manufacturing that, like deciding, oh, in this poem I'm going to use lots of lots of O sounds. That would feel a little bit artificial, but like generally I'll find a line where it's a certain sound has been prominent, and then I'll kind of run with that and then go back, and I find that really fun to go back and do it. I was going to mention it with Sarah's actually, because I tried I was getting not getting through your book, that sounds terrible, but I kept getting stopped by one poem, which was Ruined Estates, which is quite early on. And I had to, every time I opened it to carry on, I was like, no, I've got to read that one again. And I don't know what it was about that poem, but I think it's that sense of place. And I think it is the sounds. And I'm quite interested about how you use sort of detail to create this sort of sense of place. I don't think you can take the place out of any of your poems. Is that really central to you?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think by virtue of discovering poetry at a time where I'd moved continents, I moved to America in high school, and it was quite a different landscape. It was quite a different experience to growing up in Australia, where I'd been born and spent the first 12 years of my life. And so I think for me, poetry is very, very centrally connected to observing place, and there's no kind of getting rid of that. But equally, I think it's about that marriage of the image and music. And sometimes that can be a bit of a hard balance to strike, can't it? Because you can fall in love with the sound, and bringing the sound out means you may have to sort of give way a little bit to a meaning. And so for me, it's always a sort of question of testing out what is most important. Is this a poem that's about sound fundamentally? Can you weave it in where you can? But I think at times, perhaps in early poems in my career, I got completely carried away with sound because it's so fun, it's so pleasurable, to write a poem that just rides on music. But I think these days I sort of try and wield that in the service of the poem, rather than just for the joy of it. So I think there's a sort of subtle shift in that regard. Speaking of sounds, my cat is meowing frantically at the study door, so I'm sorry if you can hear that. I don't know if that's coming through Zoom, but there's a very, very continuous repeating sound going on here.
Was that something that was retained I was thinking of Laura and Juana's work. Was that something you talked about? Was the sounds coming across, or was it, because I'd heard that there were two schools of translation. There's the medium who they're faithful, and then there's the vandal that does something completely different. Was there any sense of that when you were working together?
Well, I don't believe so much in that dichotomy of like being faithful or unfaithful. Definitely when I translate, I read it out loud, and I pay a lot of attention to sound, much in the way that you guys are talking about writing your own work. But of course, I don't want to like stick alliterations in there where there's none in the original. But then at the same time, you want it to be pleasurable to listen to, and there will be like maybe a little echo here and there. And yeah, I don't know, Laura, how do you feel about the sound in your poems and the translation into
I think we even talked about it many times when we were going through the poems, like perhaps to cut the verse differently, just to make the music more similar, or that thing about the comma, or if we move it, but perhaps it's better for the rhythm, and perhaps there is a little rhyme, or there was a little rhyme in the original, and that rhyme couldn't be there in the English version, but it could be moved to another part of the poem, just like saying there are rhymes in this poem.
Yeah.
I think we paid attention to it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That's something that I really like doing, and it's a really natural way, because you don't want to force it, as we were saying. So even if you don't get to reproduce the exact rhyme in the exact place, you can maybe put another rhyme that comes more naturally different somewhere else, and you still get that sense of the rhyming. And I was thinking about that line, el bien estar y el bien hablar, that has this little kind of I don't know how you would call it, but when it rhymes at the beginning of the word, not at the end. I don't know if there's a term, but yeah, we came up with this accuracy and accord. And in a way that they're quite different words to the original. They're completely different words, but they retain a similar meaning, and you keep the sound repetition. So I was quite pleased with that. Although we did have to kind of explain it to the editor a little bit, like, yeah.
Yeah, but I love those solutions. I believe that translation is a rewriting, and also if you are a translator and a writer, it's like a kind of battle between your own writing and the writer that you are translating. So, but it's a beautiful battle, and in this case, I think we managed to, I don't know, to find a balance, and I don't know, I'm very happy with the result, and I think the music is there.
Laura, can I ask you about the first sequence, the 10 real answers to fictional questions? I love them. I just wanted to know if you set out to write a sequence and you knew it was going to be 10, or if you had these poems and you realized they went together and then you named
No,
them.
I know. It was just a joke and a game for me, because I never know what I'm doing when I'm doing it. I never plan, I never research. I mean, when it comes to writing poetry, there were different poems, and the first one had a question as a title, which is actually the first one, why we women get oven burns. And then I thought, what if I put this false questions title, or perhaps the question were real but the poem is not the answer. And I thought of making this series. I almost never do this. It's always loose poems here and there, and I thought it was funny to put them together, but they were not originally thought to be together. They were just, it's just the titles. But also in a way they are together because they were all written in the same, in a certain period of time, many, I don't know, perhaps 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So they came together to me, and then I arranged them there. It was, I don't know, I always try to laugh. Humor is also very important for me when I write and when I live in general. So it was a kind of joke for me and for you too.
We're going to need to tie up the event shortly, but before we do, Sarah mentioned Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Gray, and I was wondering whether I could ask each of you about the poets who've been important to you in your work. Starting with Sarah. Who else?
I sure can. Really, I don't think I would have been a poet if I hadn't picked up The Wild Iris by Louise Glick when I was living in America when I was about 16 years old. It was a funny thing. I was in a bookshop and someone had decided not to buy it and had left it on a chair. And I had won a high school poetry writing competition and had a little voucher to spend, and just by chance picked that book up. And I think there was something really oracular and confident and profound about the voice in those poems that really got under my skin. So Glick was hugely important to me very, very early in my writing life. More recently, I'd say, as an Australian poet, Les Murray is kind of inescapable. What a genius with language, what a brilliant writer of the Australian landscape and the Australian vernacular. I argue with Les sometimes in my head, as much as I admire him. You know, I think that's very, very common for Australian poets to have a sort of slightly complex kind of relationship to him, but he's a huge figure, I think, in my writing life and in my kind of ear and mind. So that I'll just leave it at that. But yeah, Glick and Murray, I think, says something about the aspects of my poetry that you can kind of probably see coming through.
And Laura and Juana, I'm sure a lot of people would be interested to hear about any particular Spanish language poets that have been important for either of you.
Yeah, it's very difficult for me to name, but actually the first poet that I consistently read when I was aware of what poetry was is Dylan Thomas, I must say. But but I think, and then the American poets like Eliot and Pound and William Carlos Williams and Wallace Stevens, which is one of my all-time favorites. But I think to my writing, the most important ones are the Spanish language poets, and especially the contemporary ones like Circe Maya, which is an Uruguayan poet who I love. She's my complete idol. She's like 90 years old now, and she's really great. And then all my contemporary poets, my friends and my colleagues who write together with me, they are very important for me when I write. Also some Chilean authors from Chile, like Jorge Tellier, who is, I don't know if you know it, but I love him, and I think I read his poems every month, and a lot more. It's very difficult to to name them.
Juana?
So for me, one of the very first poets that I fell in love with was the Mexican poet Jaime Sabines. He is extremely musical, and it just even made me, want to start writing and write in Spanish and play with sounds. And yeah, he's a wonderful poet. And then another one that is one of my all-time favorites is Cesar Vallejo, Peruvian poet, modernist. That was a recent book, a recent retranslation of one of his seminal works, Trilce, was published. That was very, very good, and with translation by William Rao. And then there's a Uruguayan poet that I'm enjoying quite a lot. Her name is Marosa Di Giorgio. And yeah, it's just this very kind of strange little intuitive scenes and very kind of like tiny vignettes of something that's very kind of ungraspable or something that I'm just really, really, really loving. Yeah, those are just a few.
Nia, let's go for Nia next.
It's Hopkins all day long for me. Did you say Neil? I'm so sorry.
No, I think it was Nia.
Neil. I thought he did. It's confusing. Yeah, it's Hopkins all day long. It has been for many, many years. Hopkins, Heaney, Dylan Thomas, I think, is where I really got that love of the craft, I think. And then more recently, anyone I think who's got that kind of precision of image, I find really, really appealing. So love Ivan Boland, Liz Berry, going back to HD and the Imagist poets. And my favourite poets to teach, I think, have been for a long time Grace Nichols and Gillian Clarke, just to have those kind of those precision images I absolutely love.
Nia, so we're finished with Neil.
So I'm at university. I did Renaissance and Restoration poetry, Romantic and Victorian. I think my education stopped about 1910, which probably tells in my poetry. But then the big gap was kind of filled, or the contemporary was filled with basically the Scottish poets from a generation ago. Wonderful long shadows that I'm kind of basking in. But you've got John Glenday and Kathleen Jamie, Don Patterson, Robin Robertson and John Burnside. Just in terms of, there is such a Scottish tradition that I'm proud to be part of in terms of lyrical, musical, vibrant images that maybe are not too outlandish, but hopefully do speak to people. So yeah, those two, I would say, a bit of a mix of old and new.
And a few Irish as well.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, if you've got a moment for a little story, my son wouldn't go to sleep one night, and I was saying, well, there's no more bedtime stories. You go to, I'll lie in the dark beside you, but we will listen to the audiobook I'm listening to, which is the Selected Heaney. And so we're in the dark together. He was about 7 years old, and Heaney's reading and reading. And then my son turns around to me and says, "Dad, what's a husk?" And he said husk in the way that Heaney said husk, you know, so kind of imbued with the word. It was just such an incredible moment. But yes, Heaney for sure as well.
Right. Well, that's a good note to end on. So thank you all very much. Thank you everyone for watching the event. Do scroll down for the links to the books, do all of the books, and do come and see some of their events. If you go to the Bloodaxe website, you can see where they're appearing. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.